see on the temperature gauge here, we're up to about 375 degrees, and we want to get to 400, maybe 415, depending on the bean hardness, that sort of thing. This is the control panel of the whole roaster. And we have switches to control the drum rotation, and the blower, the gas, and then this is a reset in case we hit a temperature alarm. This allows us to control the gas output, and inside the roaster here is a ceramic plate, and the gas burners are underneath the ceramic plate, and they're heating up the ceramic plate, and then it heats up the environment and acts as a heat buffer. And this is the airflow control, and right now we have it pulling all the way through the cooling bin so that we're not sucking out heated air while we're trying to heat the whole apparatus.
What are all these little timers for?
So the timers are to time various phases in the roast. I use this white timer to time the overall roast, so I'll start it and then I won't touch it. And then this one I'll start when we start the Maillard phase, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit. And then this final one I will start when we hit first crack, which I'll also talk about. And as you can see from the temperature, we're creeping up on 400, so it's time for me to drop some beans in. Start our main timer. And if you come around here, you can see in the sight glass up front here, our green beans are rolling around. So in here is a big drum that's just turning. It has fins on it, and the fins cause the beans to tumble around and come in contact with hot air, and that's the primary way that we roast the beans, is through hot air, or convection, just like the convection oven. And what we're doing now is we're waiting for the beans to equalize temperature with the environment. So the environment was at 400 degrees, the air and everything inside hit all the metal. And as soon as we put those beans in there, they brought with them cold air, and we have to get all of that heated up and equalized with the environment in the drum. So that's what we're doing now.
What temperature are we at now?
We're still dropping. We're down to 180 from 400. And in about 10 seconds, it'll bottom out and bounce back up. So at 187.3, and there it bounced back up. So about a minute 20 it bounces up. And so now what we're doing is we're in the drying phase. And we're drying any water that's not chemically bound to the beans, so water that's trapped in crevices and stuff. And we want to pass through that phase in about 4 minutes and get to what's called the Maillard phase. And the Maillard phase is when you're caramelizing sugars, a lot like when you put a steak in a hot skillet and you brown the meat. That's a Maillard reaction. We want to coast through that pretty quickly because we don't want to consume a lot of sugars, because we want those sugars to be in the cup of coffee. So we want to scoot through the Maillard phase quickly and get to first crack. And we'll hit first crack in about 9 minutes, and we want to float through first crack in about 4 or 5 minutes. And during that time, we'll be smelling and looking at the beans using this trier here, which you'll see later. Looking at the beans as they progress through the roast development phase. This is our trier, and what this does is this catches beans as they tumble through there, and it'll allow us to pull some beans out and actually try them. It's a sight to smell.
So what's all the little brown bits?
So that's what's called chaff, and it's the parchment paper that's around the coffee seeds, the coffee beans naturally. And it's what's left over and not cleaned out by the processing plant before they ship it to us. And all green beans have that. Once we hit about 300 degrees, I'm going to push some air through there to pull some of that out, kind of clean up the process and help with the roasting. So there, we just passed the dry phase and we're into now what's called the Maillard phase. And if you come around and look at the sight glass again, our beans are now a yellow color. It's hard to tell with all the chaff in there. And then they're going to progress from yellow to orange here pretty quickly. And that's all part of the physical and chemical changes that we're causing on the bean.
Is there a specific temperature that it has to be at before it'll get to first crack?
No, it can happen at different temperatures, and it's all dependent on how much pressure I've created inside the bean. So first crack, if you look over here at my hands, if you imagine a coffee bean and this is the seam of the coffee bean, as I'm roasting, I'm creating pressure. I'm vaporizing all the water inside the bean and it can't get anywhere, so the bean starts to swell and that seam starts to open up until you reach first crack, which is when the seam pops open like that and you can hear it. And it'll sound like popcorn inside the drum. And that's a significant milestone in the roasting process because first crack is the beginning of the roast development phase, which is when you generate most of the aromatics and the volatiles that create the flavor of the coffee. So now you can begin to hear the pops of first crack. You can see the beans are changing, they're looking all multy and they're orange and brown. At this point they're starting to rapidly increase in size. They'll double in size shortly.
What makes them double in size?
As we're vaporizing the water inside the bean, it's forcing the bean to swell. And there's also a second crack that I hope not to hit. I don't often hit it. The second crack comes after first crack, and second crack is when you damage the cell walls of the bean so much that you're starting to fracture the outside of the bean.
Does that have anything to do with the level of roast that you do?
Yeah, that's a darker roast. And that's a roast that we don't like to go to. I prefer the lighter roast, and I prefer to stop right on the cusp of second crack. I like to get the beans' edges swelled up and large enough that the edges are smooth. I'll show you in a little bit, but right now the edges of the beans are really bumpy. And, it's still stretching, it's kind of like old man's butt right now.
Can we see them from the dryer?
Yeah. So right now they're getting a real rich, syrupy taste or flavor, aroma to them.
And is this level of roast usable?
No, this is about the level they do for cuppings. It's a very, very light roast. And it would produce a very acidic, bright cup of coffee, kind of like, you know what a Kenyan coffee tastes like. It's that on steroids. I personally like a bright, acidic cup of coffee, but this would be extremely bright and acidic.
And what are you doing now?
I'm just I'm fluttering the burner so that I take some time in this phase. We're now in the roast development phase. Where we're doing most of the magic, where most of the chemical changes are happening in the bean. And we're creating the aromatics and the volatiles now that will become the enjoyable flavors later. And I want to coast through here in an appropriate amount of time. We want the roast to end in about 14 minutes with about 4.5, 5 minutes on the roast development time. And the exact time that we eject the beans is all determined by what we see and smell here at the trial. So you can see that the beans are darker. This is the second one. This is the first one that I pulled out, and you can see that they're darkened, and they're also, the edges are a little bit smoother as a result of the bean expanding in size.
What exactly are you smelling for?
It's hard to describe. I'm smelling for sweetness, richness. I'm looking for a pleasant aroma that is very difficult to describe. But you can see now that this is the latest one I pulled out. It's even darker than this one. We're forcing rapid changes on the beans now. We got second crack already. So you might be able to hear a couple of them snap. Yeah, in the tray. That's coasting. We just kind of coasted into second crack. Just barely though. These actually look pretty good. See how the edges are nice and round and smooth and a little bit shiny?
Mm-hmm.
If you compare it to these, this was the first bit I pulled out, and you can see that it's bumpy and the edges are round, or not as smooth. So now what I've done is I've changed the airflow. Pull air through here, so there's a fan that's underneath this tray that's sucking air down through, and you can feel the beans rapidly cooling down. In about 3 minutes they'll be at room temperature, and that's important because after 4 minutes what happens is the sugars continue, the beans, just like pasta, continue to cook after you take the heat away. They continue to cook because they have stored heat in them. And with the coffee beans, after 4 minutes, sugars start to bind with proteins, and they become not so sweet because they're no longer the sugar you want. They're something else. So we cool them down rapidly so that sugar doesn't have time to bind. And you can feel a big difference in the beans already. Now, if I were in production and I had a bunch of coffee to sell to people, I would have already started the second roast. This machine is built so that I can do back-to-back roasts, and while one roast is cooling in the tray, I can have the second one dumped in and started as soon as the roaster gets down to 400.
And how many roasts can you do in an hour, roughly?
So that roast took me 15 minutes, and I forgot to stop the timers. So I can do 3 or 4 roasts in an hour, and this machine will roast 2.2 pounds. So I can do 6 to 8 pounds of coffee in an hour. Obviously, the goal is to do as much, roast as much as possible in a short amount of time for efficiency. But right now, as I learn the whole process, my workflow, it's a little bit slow, because now what I have to do after these are all cooled and they're already at room temperature. What I would do next is I would get out the scales and I would start weighing these out, bagging them. So that was a roast cycle. These beans are done.